a millionaire came home without notice, and what he discovered would shake him to his core. Richard Hale's Ferrari pulled into his circular driveway at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. He wasn't supposed to be back from Chicago until Thursday, but the Pemberton deal had closed faster than expected. Another victory, another 8-figure profit. He loosened his Italian silk tie, already planning his evening. Maybe review the quarterly reports, check on the boys through the nanny cam, then retreat to his study with aged whiskey. But as his key turned in the mahogany door, something stopped him cold. Voices. Not the usual drone of cartoons or video games echoing from the entertainment room. Real conversation. His 8-year-old twins, Noah and Nathan, were talking. Actually talking to someone who wasn't paid to be there. Richard froze in his marble foyer, briefcase still clutched in his manicured hand. "You must first say one thing you're grateful for, before you can have it," came a gentle voice he didn't recognize. Female. Warm. Patient in a way that made his chest tighten with something he couldn't name. He moved toward the living room like a man approaching a crime scene, each step on the Persian rug muffled but deliberate. Through the archway, the scene unfolded like a painting he'd never commissioned, but somehow belonged in his house. His sons sat cross-legged on the marble floor, not the leather couches worth more than most people's cars, but the actual floor. Between them and a woman with kind eyes lay their favorite chocolate bars. The same Belgian truffles that usually disappeared within seconds of being opened. But the chocolates sat untouched. "I'm grateful for," Noah started, then stopped. His freckled face scrunched in concentration. This was the same boy who demanded everything immediately, who threw tantrums when Wi-Fi took 3 seconds to load. "Take your time," the woman said. Maria Daniels, he remembered now. The single mother from the house next door, the modest 2-story that looked like a cottage compared to his estate. The woman who worked double shifts at the hospital and still managed to keep fresh flowers in her window box. "I'm grateful for my brother," Noah finally whispered. "Even when he's annoying." Nathan giggled, a sound Richard realized he hadn't heard in months. "I'm grateful for Mama reading us stories every night." His small voice cracked. "Even though she's not here anymore." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something Richard had spent millions trying to buy, but never found. His throat constricted, as if his perfectly knotted tie had suddenly become a noose. Maria's eyes glistened, but her smile never wavered. "Those are beautiful things to be grateful for. Now you've earned your treat." As the boys unwrapped their chocolate with reverence instead of greed, Richard pressed himself against the wall. His empire, built on aggressive negotiations and hostile takeovers, felt suddenly fragile. This woman, who probably made in a year what he spent on a weekend, was teaching his children something he'd forgotten existed. The pang in his chest deepened. When was the last time he'd been grateful for anything? When had he last sat on the floor with his sons? When had he seen them show patience, kindness, or even basic consideration for each other? His phone buzzed. Another deal closing, another million earned. But for the first time in decades, Richard Hale didn't care. He watched his children eat their chocolate slowly, savoring each bite while sharing stories about their day with someone who actually listened. Someone who saw them as human beings instead of extensions of his success. The woman glanced toward the doorway, and their eyes met. No judgment, no surprise, just gentle understanding that made him feel more exposed than any boardroom battle ever had. What happened next would change everything he thought he knew about wealth, success, and what it meant to truly win in life. Subscribe before you miss what transforms this cold mansion into something extraordinary. Richard Hale wasn't born wealthy. He'd clawed his way from a cramped apartment in Detroit where cockroaches outnumbered opportunities. At 45, his name carried weight in boardrooms across 3 continents. Real estate empires, tech startups, oil ventures. If it made money, Richard owned a piece of it. Forbes called him the Golden Touch. Wall Street analysts studied his moves like chess masters examining grandmaster games. His net worth fluctuated between 1.2 and 1.8 billion, depending on market conditions. But numbers had stopped meaning anything years ago. What mattered was the game, the hunt. The moment when another competitor realized they'd been outmaneuvered by someone who'd grown up eating government cheese and wearing second-hand shoes. But success came with casualties. Claire had been his college sweetheart, the English literature major who'd believed in his dreams when he was selling insurance door to door. She'd stood by him through 18-hour workdays, missed dinners, and forgotten anniversaries. She'd even celebrated when his first real estate flip netted them $50,000, more money than they'd ever seen. But somewhere between his first million and his first 100 million, Claire had become a stranger in her own mansion. The twins were born into luxury she'd only dreamed of as a child, but they barely saw their father. Richard provided everything except presents. The divorce papers were filed on a Tuesday. Claire took nothing except custody arrangements that gave Richard alternate weekends and 2 weeks in summer. She moved to a modest house in Connecticut, traded her Mercedes for a Honda, and found work at a local elementary school. "I want our boys to know what normal feels like," she'd said during their last real conversation. "Before it's too late." That was 5 years ago. The twins spent most of their time in the 40-room mansion with a rotating staff of nannies, tutors, and housekeepers. They had everything: private chefs, personal trainers, teachers who came to them, entertainment systems worth more than most houses. But they were polite strangers to their own father. Richard told himself it was temporary, that once he closed the Singapore deal or finished the Miami development or acquired the Seattle tech firm, he'd slow down. He'd be present. He'd be the father Claire accused him of never becoming. Instead, he worked harder, made more money, built a bigger empire, won more battles in a war he'd forgotten the purpose of. Until today. Until he'd seen his sons sitting on cold marble, learning gratitude from a woman who probably worried about grocery bills while he worried about which private jet to take to which meeting. The image wouldn't leave his mind. Noah's careful words, Nathan's shy smile, Maria's patient wisdom transforming his children into human beings instead of tiny billionaires in training. For the first time since Claire left, Richard wondered if he'd been winning at the wrong game entirely. What happens when a man who owns everything realizes he has nothing? Keep watching. Maria Daniels never planned to be teaching life lessons to billionaire children on a Tuesday afternoon. At 34, her hands told the story of her life, calloused from double shifts at St. Mary's Hospital, stained from the evening cleaning jobs that paid for her daughter's school supplies, scarred from years of choosing between groceries and gas money. She'd been a different person once, pre-med student with dreams of becoming a pediatric surgeon, engaged to her college sweetheart, future mapped out in careful detail. Then life happened. The car accident that killed her fiancé, the medical bills that devoured her college fund, the pregnancy test that showed 2 pink lines when she was 26 and barely surviving. Her daughter Lila was 8 now, the same age as the Hale twins. The difference was that Lila knew the weight of $1, understood why they bought generic cereal, appreciated the rare treat of a movie night because it meant Mama had worked extra hours. Maria had watched the Hale boys through her kitchen window for months. They had everything: private playground equipment that cost more than her annual salary, clothes that never got dirty, toys that got discarded after a single use. But they moved through their mansion like ghosts, supervised by rotating staff who followed schedules instead of hearts. Today had been different. She'd been hanging laundry when she heard shouting from next door. Real anger, not playful roughhousing. Noah screaming at Nathan over a broken gaming controller. Nathan crying. Both of them hurling words that would make grown men wince. The housekeeper had simply turned up the television louder. Maria had found herself walking across the perfectly manicured lawn that separated their worlds. The gate was open. It always was when Richard traveled, as if even security was another forgotten detail. The front door was unlocked. "Excuse me," she called out. The boys had stopped fighting, startled by an unfamiliar voice. "I'm Maria. I live next door." They'd stared at her like she was an alien. When was the last time someone had introduced themselves instead of being hired? "Why are you so angry with each other?" she'd asked, settling onto their cold marble floor like it was the most natural thing in the world. The conversation that followed revealed everything she'd suspected. These children had never been taught patience, gratitude, or empathy. They'd been given everything except the tools to handle everything. So she'd improvised the chocolate lesson. Simple, visual, immediate results. She hadn't expected their father to come home early, hadn't planned to challenge a billionaire's parenting philosophy. But as she watched Noah and Nathan transform from entitled brats into curious, caring children in the span of 20 minutes, she realized something profound. Money couldn't buy what these boys needed most, and she had it in abundance. The question was whether their father was humble enough to learn from someone who counted coupons and prayed over grocery bills. Can a single mom teach a billionaire what wealth really means? The answer will surprise you. What exactly are you teaching them? Richard's voice cut through the gentle atmosphere like a blade through silk. The boys looked up, startled. Noah's chocolate-stained fingers froze halfway to his mouth. Nathan instinctively moved closer to Maria, seeking protection from the sudden shift in energy. Maria rose slowly, meeting Richard's glare with steady composure. She dealt with angry doctors, impatient supervisors, and stressed-out parents in emergency rooms. A billionaire having a tantrum didn't intimidate her. "Gratitude," she replied, her voice calm as still water. Richard's laugh was sharp and bitter, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Gratitude." He gestured around the room, at the crystal chandelier worth more than most houses, the original paintings that belonged in museums, the handcrafted furniture that screamed wealth. They live in a 40-room mansion. They have everything a child could want. What exactly should they be grateful for? "Everything," Maria said simply. "But they don't know it yet." The boys watched this exchange like spectators at a tennis match, sensing undercurrents they couldn't understand, but feeling the tension crackling between the adults. "They're 8 years old," Richard continued, his business voice emerging, controlled, authoritative, dismissive. "They need toys, games, entertainment, education. Not life lessons from," he caught himself, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "From someone like you. Someone poor. Someone who doesn't matter." Maria's smile never wavered, but something sharp flickered behind her eyes. "From someone who understands that childhood is when lessons matter most." She turned back to the boys, her demeanor shifting back to gentle warmth. "Noah, Nathan, would you like to show your father what you just learned?" The twins exchanged glances. This was uncharted territory. Their father home early, their father paying attention, their father asking about something they'd actually done. "We had to say something grateful before eating chocolate," Noah ventured, his voice small. "That's ridiculous," Richard snapped. "They don't need to earn treats. I can afford." "It's not about affording," Maria interrupted, and for the first time, her voice carried an edge. "It's about appreciating." She picked up one of the remaining chocolate bars, Belgian, expensive, the kind Richard had shipped in monthly without thinking about the cost. "Nathan, would you like another piece?" The boy nodded eagerly, then stopped. Looked at Maria. Looked at his father. I'm grateful for Maria teaching us something new." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. When was the last time his son had thanked anyone for anything other than birthday presents or Christmas gifts? "Go ahead, try it," Maria said gently, extending the chocolate toward Richard. "Say one thing you're grateful for today." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Richard Hale, who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals, who'd argued cases before judges and convinced investors to trust him with their fortunes, stood frozen by a simple request. What was he grateful for? The Chicago deal? The Singapore acquisition? The quarterly reports showing another record profit? The boys watched him with wide eyes, waiting. For the first time in their lives, they were seeing their father struggle with something that wasn't related to money or business. Richard's throat felt tight. I don't. Maria's expression softened. No judgment. No triumph. Just gentle understanding that made him feel more exposed than any hostile takeover attempt. This was a mirror he had long refused to see. And standing in his own living room, surrounded by evidence of his success, Richard realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt genuinely grateful for anything. The chocolate bar remained untouched in Maria's outstretched hand. A simple test he was failing in front of his own children. What happens when gratitude becomes impossible? The truth will shock you. That night, Richard poured himself whiskey from a bottle older than his son's and more expensive than most people's cars. But for the first time in years, he barely tasted it. He paced his study, a room lined with awards, framed magazine covers, and photographs of him shaking hands with presidents and prime ministers. Monuments to his success surrounded him, yet they felt hollow now, like props on an empty stage. Maria's words echoed in his mind. They need heart, not wealth. He dismissed her in the moment, sent her away with cold politeness, and a barely contained threat about boundaries. But alone in his fortress of achievement, her simple truth felt like acid eating through his defenses. Richard pulled up the security footage on his tablet, a habit he developed to check on the boys when traveling. He scrolled back to that afternoon, watching himself enter the living room, watching his sons' faces when they saw him. Not joy, not excitement, wariness, as if their father's presence was an interruption rather than a gift. He fast-forwarded to the moment Maria asked him to name something he was grateful for, watched his own face contort with confusion and something that looked dangerously close to panic. A billionaire stumped by the most basic human exercise. The footage didn't lie. His sons had transformed in Maria's presence, patient, thoughtful, kind. The same children who threw tantrums over Wi-Fi speed and demanded new toys weekly had sat quietly, contemplating gratitude like tiny philosophers. What did that say about him as a father? Claire's voice surfaced from buried memories. You'll raise bank accounts, not sons, Richard. They'll have everything except a heart. He'd accused her of being dramatic, emotional, impractical. Money solved problems. Money provided opportunities. Money was love in its most useful form. Now, her prophecy had a new messenger. A woman who counted coupons and worked double shifts, who wore the same jacket 3 seasons running and drove a car held together by prayers and duct tape. Yet she'd accomplished in 20 minutes what his millions couldn't buy. She'd made his sons better people. The whiskey glass trembled in his hand. When had he become the kind of man who couldn't answer a child's question about gratitude? When had success become such a fortress that simple human connections couldn't penetrate it? He thought about his own childhood, the cockroaches, the government cheese, the shame of wearing second-hand clothes to school. He'd sworn his children would never experience that humiliation. They'd have everything he'd been denied. But somewhere in his crusade to give them everything, he'd forgotten to give them anything that mattered. The security footage continued playing. Maria gathering her purse, his sons hugging her goodbye. Actual hugs, not the awkward pats they gave him on scheduled weekend visits. Their faces fell as she left, as if light was being drained from the room. It was subtle, but it cut sharper than any boardroom rejection, any failed acquisition, any financial loss he'd ever endured. Sometimes the poorest person in the room is the richest man. Don't miss what happens next. Richard didn't sleep that night. By dawn, he convinced himself that Maria Daniels was the problem, not him. She was overstepping, interfering, taking advantage of his children's loneliness and his temporary absence. Who was she to judge his parenting? A woman who couldn't afford health insurance, criticizing a man who could buy hospitals? At 7:30 a.m., While his sons ate breakfast prepared by their private chef, Richard marched across the manicured lawn to the modest house next door. Maria's old Honda sat in the driveway, morning dew beating on its scratched hood. The contrast between their properties was jarring. His sprawling estate versus her simple two-story home with its cheerful yellow shutters and overgrown garden. He rang the doorbell with more force than necessary. Maria answered in scrubs, clearly preparing for another hospital shift. Her daughter Lila peeked out from behind her, a girl with bright eyes and hand-me-down clothes that were clean but clearly worn. "I don't want you overstepping anymore," Richard said without preamble. "They're my sons." Maria studied him with those same steady eyes that had unsettled him yesterday. No anger, no defensiveness, just quiet assessment that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Then raise them," she replied simply. "Don't just provide for them. Be present." The words landed with surgical precision, finding every insecurity he'd buried under layers of achievement and accumulation. "I give them everything," he shot back, his voice rising. "Private education, personal trainers, trips around the world. Experiences most adults never have. They want for nothing." "Except a father," Maria said, and Lila tugged on her mother's scrubs, sensing the tension. "Mama, we're going to be late," the little girl whispered. Maria's expression softened as she looked down at her daughter, then back at Richard. The contrast was stark, a mother who worked multiple jobs but still made time for bedtime stories, versus a father who hired staff to handle bedtime routines. "They don't need more stuff, Mr. Hale," Maria continued, shouldering her worn purse. "They need someone who knows their favorite stories, who notices when they're sad, who teaches them that happiness doesn't come from a credit card." Pride battled humility in Richard's chest like gladiators in an arena. Control battled connection. The man who'd built an empire on never showing weakness felt exposed, vulnerable, small. "You don't know anything about raising children with resources," he said, grasping for the high ground. "You don't understand the pressure, the expectations, the opportunities they'll have." Maria paused at her car door, keys in hand. "You're right. I don't understand those things." She looked back at him, her gaze penetrating. "But I understand love, and they're starving for it." She drove away in her dented Honda, leaving Richard standing on her cracked driveway, feeling both exposed and awakened. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Hale wondered if he was losing the most important negotiation of his life. When pride meets truth, everything changes. Subscribe to see what breaks first. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard's mansion like bullets against bulletproof glass. He'd returned early again. The pattern was becoming habit, though he wouldn't admit it to himself. The London merger could wait. His assistant could handle the calls. For reasons he couldn't explain, home had become more compelling than any boardroom. But what he discovered this time shattered every defense he'd built around his heart. The children sat at his dining room table, the mahogany masterpiece that cost more than most people's houses, where formal dinners for business associates usually took place. Today, it hosted something far more precious and infinitely more dangerous to his carefully constructed world. 3 small heads bent over sheets of paper. Noah, Nathan, and Lila, Maria's daughter, were writing letters. Not typing on tablets or dictating to voice assistants, but actually writing with pencils, their tongues poking out in concentration. "What are you working on?" he asked, approaching cautiously. "Letters to people we appreciate," Lila explained without looking up, her worn sneakers swinging from the expensive chair. "Mama says it's important to tell people how they make you feel." Richard's breath caught. When was the last time anyone had written him a letter? When was the last time he'd written one? Business emails didn't count. Contracts weren't communications. His entire correspondence consisted of demands, negotiations, and transactions. "Can I see?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Noah held up his paper. Crayon marks smudged across lined notebook paper that looked foreign in this palace of marble and gold. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, heartbreakingly innocent. Dear Dad, I love you, but I miss you. You have the biggest house and the fastest car, and you can buy anything, but you're never here. Please stay home more. I want to show you my drawings and tell you about school, and maybe watch movies together like Lila does with her mom. Love, Noah. P.S. Maria taught me that saying I love you is like giving someone a present they can keep forever. The paper trembled in Richard's hands. Through blurred vision, he saw Nathan's letter, similar words, different handwriting. Same desperate love from a child who barely knew his father. Then Lila's letter to her mother, full of gratitude for bedtime stories and homemade cookies and walks in the park. Simple pleasures that cost nothing but meant everything. The rain outside seemed to echo inside his chest, a storm of emotions he'd buried under decades of accumulation and achievement. His sons loved him. Despite his absence, his coldness, his substitution of things for time, they loved him. And they were slipping away. Mr. Hale? Lila's small voice broke through his revelation. Are you sad? Mama says it's okay to cry sometimes. He was a man who controlled billion-dollar empires, who made decisions that affected thousands of jobs, who'd never shown weakness in any negotiation. But standing in his own dining room, holding letters from children who saw right through his armor, Richard felt powerless. Wealthless in every way that mattered. Maria appeared in the doorway, having returned from tucking freshly folded laundry into the boys' rooms, another task his housekeeper should have handled, but somehow Maria had claimed as her own. Their eyes met across the room. No words necessary. She saw the tears he was trying to hide, the transformation happening in real time, the moment when presence became the only currency that mattered. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Hale understood that he'd been investing in the wrong assets entirely. If this moment moved you, subscribe. Learn lessons the richest don't always teach themselves. The next morning changed everything. Instead of rushing to his study with coffee and financial reports, Richard did something revolutionary. He sat down at the breakfast table with his sons. No phone, no laptop, no urgent emails demanding immediate attention. The boys looked startled, as if a celebrity had joined them for cereal. What did you learn yesterday? He asked, the question feeling foreign in his mouth. When had he last asked about their day without multitasking? Noah nearly choked on his orange juice, surprised by genuine interest from his father. Maria taught us about compliments. Compliments. Yeah, like telling someone something nice about them. Not fake nice, but real nice. Noah's face lit up with the memory. She said giving a compliment can make someone's whole day better, and it doesn't cost anything. Nathan nodded eagerly, finally relaxed enough to join the conversation. And she taught us about helping people. Like when Lila dropped her crayons, I helped pick them up. Maria said helping someone doesn't have to cost money. It just costs being kind. Richard set down his coffee cup, giving them his complete attention for the first time in. He couldn't remember how long. What else? Oh, Lila bounced in her chair. Somehow she'd become a regular at their breakfast table, and Richard realized he didn't mind. Being kind can be fun. Like when we made thank you cards for the mailman and the garbage truck drivers. They smiled so big. The mailman, the garbage truck drivers, people Richard passed without seeing, whose services he used without acknowledging. His sons were learning to notice humanity he'd trained himself to ignore. Richard struggled for words. That's wonderful. The simple praise made both boys beam brighter than any expensive gift ever had. For the first time in his adult life, Richard understood something profound. Heart mattered more than gold. Connection trumped acquisition. Presence was worth more than presence. He thought about his own childhood, when a kind word from a teacher could sustain him through weeks of struggle. When his mother's attention, rare between her 3 jobs, felt more valuable than any luxury he now took for granted. Can I try? Richard asked hesitantly. The children looked at him expectantly. Nathan, I noticed you helped your brother with his backpack yesterday. That was really thoughtful. Richard's voice felt rusty with disuse of genuine praise. And Noah, the way you listened to Lila when she was sad about missing her dad, that showed real kindness. Both boys straightened, their faces glowing with pride that had nothing to do with material rewards. Lila clapped her small hands together. See? It feels good, doesn't it, Mr. Hale? It did feel good. Better than closing any deal. Better than any profit margin. Better than any acquisition he'd ever celebrated. Richard glanced at the clock, 8:15 a.m. Usually, he'd be halfway through his third conference call by now. Today, he was exactly where he needed to be. When a billionaire discovers what money can't buy, everything transforms. Keep watching. That afternoon, Richard's old instincts kicked in like muscle memory. He'd been watching Maria teach the children for 3 days now, observing her methods like a CEO studying a competitor's strategy. Part of him admired her approach, the patience, the creativity, the genuine care. But another part, the part that had built an empire through control and dominance, bristled at being a spectator in his own home. He found her in the garden with all 3 children, helping them plant seeds in small pots. Dirt under their fingernails, smudges on their clothes. Genuine laughter floating through the afternoon air. "Maria," he said, his business voice emerging without permission. "I appreciate what you're doing here, but I think it's time I took over their lessons." She looked up from the marigold seeds she was helping Lila count, her expression unreadable. The children continued their planting, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension. "Took over," she repeated calmly. "Yes, I'm their father. I decide what they learn and how they learn it." The words felt familiar, comfortable. The same tone he used in boardrooms when asserting authority. Maria stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands with deliberate care. When she spoke, her voice carried no anger, no defensiveness, just quiet certainty that made his declaration sound hollow. "Guidance is not control, Mr. Hale. Influence is not command." The words hit him like cold water. He flinched, recognizing the truth he'd spent decades avoiding. "I know what's best for my sons," he insisted. But even to his own ears, the statement sounded desperate rather than authoritative. "Do you?" Maria asked gently. "Because for 8 years, you've given them everything except what they needed most." Noah looked up from his pot, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Dad, are you and Maria having a fight?" The innocent question pierced through Richard's armor. Here was his son, worried about conflict between the adults he cared about. When had Noah ever shown concern for Richard's feelings before? "We're just talking," Maria said soothingly, but her eyes remained on Richard. Sometimes grown-ups need to figure things out together. Richard watched his sons return to their planting, their trust in Maria absolute. They followed her guidance not because she demanded it, but because she'd earned it through presence, patience, and genuine care. Everything he'd tried to achieve through authority, she'd accomplished through authenticity. "Connection always trumps power," Maria said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "You can't buy their hearts, Mr. Hale. You can only earn them." Standing in his own garden, surrounded by evidence of his wealth, but feeling poorer than ever, Richard realized he was fighting the wrong battle. This wasn't about territory or control or who had the right to teach his children. This was about whether he was brave enough to learn alongside them. For the first time in his business career, Richard Hale considered the radical possibility that surrender might be stronger than conquest. What happens when a man built on control learns to let go? The transformation is incredible. 3 weeks passed like a slow awakening from a decade-long sleep. Richard found himself doing things he'd never imagined. Sitting on the floor during story time, mediating disputes over cardboard box forts, helping with math homework at the kitchen table instead of his intimidating study. Today, all 3 children had turned the living room into what they called Cardboard City, a sprawling metropolis built from Amazon boxes, paper towel tubes, and masking tape. It looked like chaos to Richard's organized mind, but the children moved through it with the confidence of urban planners. The bridge is broken. Lila announced dramatically, pointing to a collapsed toilet paper tube spanning 2 shoeboxes. "We need an emergency meeting," Noah declared, gathering everyone in the cardboard town square. Richard found himself appointed as chief engineer, tasked with designing a stronger bridge. For a man who'd financed actual bridge construction projects, this felt both absurd and strangely important. "What if we use 3 tubes instead of 1? Nathan suggested. "And maybe some tape underneath for extra support?" Lila added. As they worked together, Richard realized something profound was happening. His sons were problem-solving, collaborating, thinking creatively, skills no amount of private tutoring had successfully taught them. "There," Noah announced as their reinforced bridge held steady under the weight of toy cars. "Teamwork makes it stronger." Richard caught Maria's eye across the room. She was folding laundry, another task she'd seamlessly absorbed, but watching their interaction with quiet satisfaction. A silent nod passed between them, mutual acknowledgement of progress neither had expected. For the first time since Claire left, Richard laughed freely. Not the calculated chuckle he used in business meetings, but genuine, unguarded laughter that bubbled up from a place he'd forgotten existed. "Dad, you're really good at this," Nathan said, adding a cardboard chimney to their city hall. The simple praise meant more than any Forbes article or business award he'd ever received. "I'm learning," Richard admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. Maria smiled from across the room, not the polite smile strangers exchanged, but the warm recognition between people who understood each other. Later that evening, after the children were asleep and Cardboard City had been carefully preserved for tomorrow's adventures, Richard and Maria sat in his kitchen drinking coffee from mismatched mugs. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing what I couldn't. For caring when I was absent. For teaching them." He paused, struggling with words that felt too big for his mouth. "For teaching all of us that lessons can be shared." Maria's expression softened. "Hearts were opening, Mr. Hale. That's all. Sometimes we just need someone to show us the door." Outside, rain began to fall again, but this time it sounded gentle, cleansing rather than harsh. For the first time in years, Richard felt like he was exactly where he belonged. When success finally meets significance, magic happens. Don't miss what comes next. Thursday afternoon shattered everything Richard thought he knew about his journey. He found Maria in his study, the sacred space where billion-dollar deals were born and empires expanded. She stood before his wall of awards and accolades, holding a manila envelope with hands that trembled slightly. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice carrying a weight he'd never heard before. Richard's instinct sharpened. In business, envelopes delivered privately usually contained lawsuits, blackmail, or devastating news. "What is it?" Maria's eyes glistened as she extended the envelope toward him. "These are from Claire." The name hit him like a physical blow. His ex-wife had been dead for 2 years, cancer that moved faster than any hostile takeover he'd ever faced. The woman who tried to teach him about love, who'd warned him about raising bank accounts instead of sons, who died believing he'd never change. "I don't understand," Richard whispered. "She wrote to me, multiple letters, over the past 3 years. Before Maria's voice caught. She knew she was dying, and she knew the boys would need someone to teach them what she couldn't finish." With shaking hands, Richard opened the envelope. Claire's elegant handwriting, the same script that had once filled love notes in his college textbooks, covered pages of cream-colored stationery. "Dear Maria, if you're reading this, then God has called me home, and my boys need what I can no longer give them. I've watched you with Lila through our fence, seen the patience and love you pour into every moment. You understand what Richard has forgotten. That love is more than providing. He's not a bad man, Maria. He's lost. Success became his language, money became his love letter, and control became his security blanket. But underneath all that armor is the young man I fell in love with, someone who understands struggle, who has capacity for tremendous love, if he can just remember how to access it." Patience, listening, and presence matter more than anything his wealth can buy. Teach this to my sons. And if possible, teach it to their father. The boys will need guidance, not gifts. Connection, not correction. Show them that a person's worth isn't measured in dollars, but in the difference they make in others' lives. I know this is an enormous request, but you're the only person I trust to help Richard become the father I always knew he could be. With love and desperate hope, Claire. Richard's vision blurred as he read letter after letter. Claire's detailed observations about his failures, her hopes for his transformation, her belief that Maria could accomplish what she couldn't. The billionaire who was accustomed to controlling every outcome, who orchestrated mergers and manipulated markets, realized he'd been played by the two women who understood him better than he understood himself. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't chance. This was Claire's final gift, a plan set in motion years ago by a dying woman who still believed in the man she'd once loved. When love plans beyond death, miracles become possible. Subscribe to see how. The revelation changed everything, but not in the way Richard expected. Instead of feeling manipulated or deceived, he felt grateful. Claire had seen his potential when he couldn't see it himself. She'd orchestrated his salvation through the one person capable of reaching him. The next morning, Richard made a decision that would have shocked his former self. He canceled his meetings for the entire week. Mr. Hale, the Singapore investors are flying in specifically to, his assistant began. Reschedule everything, Richard interrupted. I have more important work to do. That important work began at the breakfast table, but it didn't end there. Richard threw himself into mentoring with the same intensity he'd once applied to hostile takeovers. But instead of crushing competitors, he was building character. Instead of maximizing profits, he was maximizing moments. He started small, asking Nathan about his favorite book, listening to Noah describe his dreams, including Lila in conversations about her art projects. Each interaction felt like learning a new language, one where listening mattered more than speaking, where questions were more valuable than answers. The daily rituals evolved naturally. Morning gratitude sessions over pancakes, not the formal dining room affairs he'd once hosted for business associates, but real conversations around the kitchen island. Evening story time, where he discovered his son's imaginations were more creative than any marketing campaign he'd funded. Today, I want to teach you something my dad never taught me, Richard told the three children one afternoon. They sat in the garden where Maria first challenged his worldview, but now he was the teacher. What's that? Lila asked, her small hand dirty from planting the tomatoes they'd started from seeds. That saying I don't know isn't failure. It's the beginning of learning. The children exchanged glances, surprised by this admission from the man who seemed to have all the answers. I don't know how to be a good dad, Richard continued, the words feeling foreign but necessary. But I'm learning. Every day, I'm learning from you. Noah, emboldened by this unexpected vulnerability, asked, Dad, why did you work so much before? The question that would have annoyed him months ago now felt like an opportunity. Because I thought that was how I showed love. I thought providing for you meant being away from you. I was wrong. But you're here now, Nathan said simply, the forgiveness in his voice nearly breaking Richard's heart. I'm here now, Richard agreed. And I'm not leaving. He discovered joy in guiding rather than commanding, in suggesting rather than demanding, in being present rather than just providing. Each small victory. Nathan sharing his toys without prompting, Noah comforting a crying classmate, both boys writing thank you notes to their teachers, felt more significant than any business triumph. Maria watched from the kitchen window as Richard helped the children build a bird feeder. His expensive suit replaced by jeans and an old t-shirt, his commanding presence softened into patient instruction. Claire's plan was working better than anyone could have imagined. When a father finally learns to love, children bloom. Don't miss what happens next. 2 months into his transformation, Richard began noticing changes that no quarterly report could capture. The twins had stopped asking for new toys every week. Instead, Noah spent afternoons reading to elderly residents at the local nursing home, a volunteer activity he'd chosen himself. Nathan had started a small garden in their backyard, sharing vegetables with neighbors who couldn't afford fresh produce. These weren't behaviors Richard had demanded or incentivized. They were organic expressions of character development that money couldn't buy. Mr. Hale called Mrs. Patterson from across the street as Richard walked to get the mail. The elderly widow had lived in the modest house for 40 years, watching his mansion rise behind its gates like a fortress. "I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" Richard paused, confused. "Your boys helped me carry groceries yesterday. Wouldn't take a penny for it. Said their dad taught them that helping neighbors was just what good people do." Her weathered face crinkled into a genuine smile. "Those are special children you're raising." Richard felt a warmth that had nothing to do with profit margins or stock prices. His sons were becoming good humans, not just successful ones. At school, the changes were equally dramatic. Noah's teacher called to report that he'd started mediating playground disputes instead of starting them. Nathan had organized a classroom supply drive for students whose families couldn't afford materials. "I've never seen such a transformation in children," Ms. Rodriguez told Richard during their parent conference. "Whatever you're doing at home, it's working." What he was doing at home was learning alongside them. Every neighborhood interaction became a classroom for character development. When they encountered a homeless veteran outside the grocery store, Richard didn't hurry past, as he once would have. Instead, he bought the man lunch and sat with him, letting his sons see that everyone had a story worth hearing. When the twins witnessed a schoolmate being bullied, they didn't ignore it or join in. They stood up for the kid and invited him to play, creating inclusion where there had been isolation. Family time transformed from scheduled obligations into cherished opportunities. Homework at the kitchen table became collaborative problem-solving sessions. Bedtime stories evolved into discussions about the day's lessons and tomorrow's possibilities. Even Lila, who wasn't his biological child but had become part of their unconventional family, was flourishing. Her grades improved, her confidence blossomed, and her natural kindness found expression in small acts of service around the house. Richard found himself looking forward to these simple moments more than any business meeting. The sound of children's laughter in his house, the smell of Maria's homemade cookies replacing expensive catered meals, the sight of 3 small faces gathered around a book. These had become his most valuable assets. Character, it turned out, was the best investment he'd ever made. Not because it generated returns, but because it generated real wealth. The kind measured in relationships rather than revenue. When character becomes currency, everyone gets rich. Keep watching this transformation. That night, alone in his study with Claire's letters spread across his desk, Richard forced himself to confront the ghosts he'd been avoiding. The memories came in waves, each one a knife twist of regret and missed opportunity. Noah's 5th birthday party. Richard had been in Tokyo, closing a deal that netted him $20 million. He'd sent an expensive gift, a robot that cost more than most families spend on Christmas, but missed the moment when his son blew out his candles and wished for his daddy to come home. Nathan's first school play. Richard had promised to be there, but a last-minute emergency in his London office kept him away. Nathan had scanned the audience during his one line, his small face falling when he couldn't find his father among the crowd. The twins' first day of school. Claire had sent photos, 2 nervous boys in oversized backpacks, holding hands for courage. Richard had been in a board meeting, his phone on silent, completely unaware that his children were taking their first steps into the world without him. Years of missed bedtime stories, skipped family dinners, forgotten school events, and hollow luxury that filled every room except the ones that mattered most. He'd given them everything except himself. The flashbacks were relentless, endless business trips while his sons grew up through video calls, birthday presents chosen by assistants, Christmas mornings interrupted by urgent phone calls about market fluctuations in Asia. But mixed in with the regret were new memories, bright spots that Maria had helped create. Each lesson she taught became an anchor, bridging gaps he'd thought were permanent. The morning Noah had hugged him goodbye actually hugged him, instead of the awkward handshake they'd shared for years. The evening Nathan had asked him to read another chapter, not because it was bedtime routine, but because he genuinely wanted to spend more time together. The Sunday afternoon, all three children had fallen asleep during movie time, curled against him on the couch like he was someone they trusted completely. Maria's guidance had given him tools he'd never known existed. Patience instead of impatience. Presence instead of presence. Questions instead of commands. Listening instead of lecturing. He picked up one of Claire's letters, reading her words again. Show them that a person's worth isn't measured in dollars, but in the difference they make in others' lives. The difference he was making now wasn't in quarterly reports or profit margins. It was in the way Noah smiled when he walked through the door, in Nathan's excited stories about school, in Lila's casual inclusion of him in her prayers at bedtime. Richard had spent decades building an empire, but only recently had he started building a family. The past couldn't be changed, but every day forward was an opportunity to choose differently, to be present instead of productive, to prioritize relationships over revenue. Claire's letters had shown him the map. Maria had guided the journey, but the destination, becoming the father his sons deserved, was his responsibility to reach. When the past meets purpose, redemption becomes possible. The finale will amaze you. The rain outside hammered against the glass, a constant rhythm against the quiet stillness inside. Richard gathered the children on a rainy evening, not in his study or a game room, but in the heart of the home he had finally learned to love, the kitchen. The children were quiet, sensing the gravity in their father's demeanor. This wasn't a punishment or a lecture. This was something different. It was the final piece of a puzzle he had spent a lifetime trying to solve. When I was a boy, Richard began, his voice surprisingly gentle, I thought power came from a big bank account. I thought being in control meant being alone at the top. I thought success was about what I could buy, not what I could build. Noah and Nathan listened intently, their eyes fixed on their father, a man transformed. Lila sat a little closer, her hand clutching Maria's, a silent show of support. But being rich doesn't make you powerful, Richard continued, his gaze sweeping over the three faces. Being loved, kind, and present, that's true power. It's the only thing that matters. Lila smiled knowingly, a simple, heartwarming gesture that confirmed everything he was saying. She understood this truth better than anyone. Noah looked at Nathan, and Nathan looked back at him, an unspoken understanding passing between the twins. Their father had finally seen the world through their eyes. Then he stood and walked to the wall of framed awards in his study, returning with a single, unadorned certificate. He placed it on the kitchen table. It wasn't a document of a new acquisition or a profitable merger. It was a deed for the modest two-story home next door. This is for you, Maria, he said, pushing the paper toward her. The mortgage is paid in full. There's also a fund set up for Lila's education and your family's care. Enough so you never have to worry about a double shift again. Maria's eyes widened, then filled with tears. She shook her head, trying to give it back. Mr. Hale, I couldn't possibly. This isn't a payment, Maria, Richard said, his voice firm but compassionate. This is a gift. The greatest gift I have to give. It's what I learned from you, what Claire knew you had all along. It's the difference between providing for someone and giving them freedom. The children watched this exchange, understanding that something more than a transaction was happening. It wasn't about the money. It was about the intention. It was a gesture of pure gratitude, a final surrender of his old self. You taught me, Richard said to Maria, his voice thick with emotion, that a person's worth isn't measured in dollars, but in the difference they make in others' lives. You and Claire saved mine. This is me trying to thank you." Lila rushed to her mother, burying her face in the woman's scrubs. Noah and Nathan, without a word, came forward and hugged Maria as well. The act was so simple, so genuine, and so unlike the boys he'd met 3 months ago. The family he'd always wanted, but never knew how to build, was standing right in front of him. This isn't about money. It's about what money can't buy. If this struck a chord, subscribe. Don't miss more life-changing journeys. Richard's presence stabilized family life. The mansion, once silent, was filled with laughter, lessons, and love. Children carried lessons beyond wealth, sharing their simple truths with everyone they met. Richard's transformation wasn't a momentary blip. It was a permanent change that rippled outward. The years passed. The boys grew up, but they never lost the lessons learned on their cold marble floor. They became young men who treated people with respect, who understood the value of a kind word, and who knew that a person's true worth was in their character, not their bank account. Richard established a foundation in Claire's memory. It wasn't a typical charitable organization that focused on donations. It was a mentor program that paired vulnerable children with adults who taught life lessons without a price tag. Patience, gratitude, humility, the same simple values Maria had taught his boys. The foundation was a testament to his journey, the one he'd been on without even knowing. The sprawling mansion, once a symbol of his loneliness, became a hub of activity. It hosted community events, team-building exercises for the foundation, and birthday parties for children who never thought they'd step foot in a place like this. The cold marble foyer, where he'd stood on that fateful Tuesday, was now a place where families gathered, where children played, and where laughter echoed. Richard was no longer the man Wall Street analysts studied. He was a man who still closed deals, but now they were deals of a different kind, deals that built communities, that mentored young people, that connected people to a world of kindness they had never known. He watched Noah, now a successful architect, volunteer his time to design affordable housing. He saw Nathan, a rising star in social work, create programs to help struggling families with the wisdom he'd learned from Maria. He saw Lila, a kind and brilliant young woman, thriving as a doctor, helping children with the empathy she had learned from her mother. Their success wasn't measured in dollars, but in the difference they made in others' lives. And on quiet afternoons, when the sun shone through the now welcoming windows, Richard would sit on the marble floor with his grandchildren and the children next door, teaching them to say what they were grateful for. He'd watch them unwrap a piece of chocolate, their faces lit up not by greed, but by genuine appreciation. The empire he built was no longer a monument to his ego. It was a legacy of love, kindness, and gratitude. And that he had finally learned was the truest win of all. If this story taught you that true wealth is more than money, subscribe. Don't be left behind. The transformation wasn't limited to the Hale mansion. Like a pebble dropped in a pond, the ripple effect of Richard's newfound wisdom spread into the world around them. Outside the gates of his estate, the boys' small acts of kindness began to add up, a testament to the quiet power of a changed heart. Noah, Nathan, and Lila displayed empathy in school, in the neighborhood, in small acts unnoticed but meaningful. One afternoon, Noah saw a classmate struggling to carry a stack of books and a heavy backpack. Without a word, he simply took the books and walked the girl to her class. The girl's mother later called Richard, not to thank him for a favor, but to say she'd never seen such a simple, genuine gesture. It wasn't about a reward. It was about being present to someone's need. In the neighborhood, Nathan noticed the elderly couple at the end of the street had an overflowing recycling bin they couldn't manage. He and Lila spent the next hour sorting it for them, refusing the money the couple offered. When Richard asked why they'd done it, Nathan simply said, "Their smiles were worth more than money, Dad." Richard's influence grew not through control, but through consistency and care. He no longer made demands, he made suggestions. Instead of telling his sons what to do, He showed them through his own actions, whether it was helping a neighbor fix a broken fence or volunteering at the local soup kitchen. His presence was now the most powerful tool in his arsenal. The community had seen the cold, distant billionaire for years. Now, they were seeing the caring, present father. The boys' empathy became their greatest currency. Their teachers noticed it in the way they handled conflicts, their classmates saw it in their leadership, and their neighbors felt it in their kindness. It was a new kind of wealth, one that was given freely and returned a hundredfold. The most valuable asset Richard had ever acquired wasn't a company or a stock portfolio. It was the character of his sons. This shift in influence will change his business world, too. Subscribe to see what happens when the heart starts leading the portfolio. The final step in Richard's journey was a quiet, internal revolution. He learned that wealth without heart was hollow, a beautiful shell with nothing inside. The awards in his study, once monuments to his pride, now felt like reminders of a life he was grateful to have left behind. His daily routines, once a rigid schedule of meetings and deals, now included gratitude exercises, helping neighbors, and cultivating empathy. Every morning, he'd find himself walking the perimeter of his property, not to check for security breaches, but to look at the sky, the trees, and his home, all the simple things he had once taken for granted. He started a new ritual with the children. Every night before bed, they would sit together and name 3 things they were truly grateful for from their day. The ritual was not about big, expensive events. It was about a warm cup of hot chocolate, a kind word from a teacher, or the laughter of a friend. Richard's own list was always about them, the moments of connection, the hugs, the small lessons they taught him. He once saw a neighbor struggling to jumpstart their car. In his old life, he would have called an assistant to have a car delivered. Now he simply grabbed a pair of jumper cables and helped, a simple act that felt more satisfying than closing a multi-million-dollar deal. The neighbor, a mechanic, offered to change his oil for free. The trade was not about money, but about humanity. This new sense of gratitude had replaced the arrogance that had defined his life. He no longer saw himself as a self-made man who had conquered the world. He saw himself as a man who had been given a second chance, a man who had been saved by the love of 2 women and the simple truths taught by a single mother. The cold, unforgiving man who had once built an empire on conquest had finally found his purpose. He wasn't just a provider, he was a presence. He wasn't just a success, he was a human being. He wasn't the man who had everything, but the man who was finally learning to be grateful for what he had. This is the ultimate lesson of true wealth. If you want more stories that show the heart of what matters, subscribe now. For Richard Hale, the world had been a game of strategy, where every move was designed to secure an advantage. But over the past few months, he had discovered a new kind of power, one that came not from winning a negotiation, but from making a connection. It was a quiet, profound power that was measured not in fortune, but in presence. The story was no longer just about him. It was about a convergence. It was Claire's legacy, a dying woman's desperate plan to save the people she loved. It was Maria's guidance, a single mother's selfless choice to share what she had in abundance, empathy and kindness. And it was Richard's awakening, the painful but necessary realization that his life, for all its opulence, had been empty. This powerful combination came together in a family learning to love responsibly. Responsible love was more than providing food and shelter. It was about teaching children to appreciate what they had, not just to want more. It was about showing up not just when it was convenient, but when it was needed. It was about giving of yourself, not just of your money. Richard had become a teacher, not just a boss. He taught his sons to listen, to feel, and to understand that the people in their lives were not extensions of his success, but human beings with their own stories. He had given them the tools to navigate a world that would inevitably try to measure them by their father's wealth. He taught them to be measured by their own character instead. The moral was simple, yet it had taken a billionaire years to understand it. The truest power in the world is the ability to positively change a life, to be a source of strength for others, and to love without conditions. This lesson, learned in a kitchen and a garden, was worth more than his entire empire. The final piece of this story is not about the money he gave away, but the person he became. Subscribe to see the final act. It will challenge everything you think you know about success. The mansion, once a fortress of wealth and loneliness, became a home. The echoing hallways, once filled with the silence of solitude, now hummed with laughter, conversation, and the chaotic energy of 3 children, a new, extended family bound not by blood, but by love. Lila thrived, her quiet confidence blossoming as she found a second home and a new kind of father figure. The twins grew mindful, their sense of entitlement replaced by a deep appreciation for the world around them. Richard finally understood. The richest lessons come from the humblest places. They came from Maria's 2-story house, from a simple chocolate bar, from the garden where he first learned to get his hands dirty. The first day he froze at what Maria was teaching would echo forever in his mind. It was a memory he didn't want to forget, a constant reminder of the man he used to be and the man he had become. It was a moment of profound change, a tiny crack in his armor that had allowed love and humility to flood in. It was a testament that sometimes wealth isn't enough, but heart can change everything. Richard now measured his life in moments, not millions. In the way Noah's face lit up when he taught him a new song on the piano. In Nathan's shy smiles. In the way Maria's hand felt in his as they sat on the porch, watching their children play. He was no longer defined by the businesses he owned, but by the love he gave. His legacy would not be his net worth, but the compassion of his sons. It was the children they were raising, the values they were instilling, and the kind of humans they were becoming. He had built a dynasty of a different kind, a legacy of the heart. And in the end, it was not the billionaire who won the most. It was the man who learned to live with an open heart. The greatest success is the person you become, and the greatest gift you can give is to be present. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.